Hey, welcome to On the Clock, a collaboration between the Pack Day Podcast and the Draft Fellows. I'm Andrew Mertig. That is Kyle Fellows, and together we are the Draft Fellows. Leading up to the draft, we'll be doing a series that covers picks 1 through 32, that team's biggest need, who they should be considering at that pick, and then a few options for who they might pick at that selection. You can check out the video of all 32 episodes of On the Clock on the Draft Fellows channel on YouTube. The audio versions are on Pack-A-Day. We hope you have been hanging with us through this project, and we are officially at the halfway point, Kyle.
Yes. The halfway point, we've made it. We're on to pick 16, and we are up to the Arizona Cardinals here. Excited to continue this conversation. And Arizona is interesting. This is a team that could go in a lot of different directions with a lot of different needs, right? They could go offensive line, they could address defensive line, they could also look at addressing their secondary. And I guess the Cardinals' offensive line is fairly stable. Paris Johnson looks like he's been a great pick there at the tackle spot, and they have serviceable starters along the rest of the line, but they could use an upgrade at guard. Will Hernandez was supposed to be that piece for this team, but Arizona lost him to a knee injury last year, and he is actually still a free agent, kind of one of those lingering guys out there who has the medical questions coming off of the injury. So maybe they bring him back, or maybe they replace him in the draft. That's one direction they could go. The Cardinals signed Dalvin Tomlinson in free agency, and he is probably their best defensive lineman going into this coming season, which does mean that they still need to add to that position. So defensive line could certainly be a priority early for them. And then they could also use some help in the secondary, like I mentioned, specifically at perimeter corner. Garrett Williams was a really nice surprise for them at the nickel spot last year, but they also drafted Max Melton, who did play outside, but in the pre-draft, I always felt like was more of a slot inside player. So they could definitely look to add a boundary corner to kind of balance things out there in the desert.
Yeah, and I think the Cardinals, you mentioned Delvin Tomlinson, but they made a number of really impressive moves to shore up their defense. I loved what they did in free agency, and I think that puts them in a much better position to focus on their bigger needs and not have to try to accumulate more draft resources, which I think would have been a strategy coming in if they hadn't gotten as many hits as they did in free agency. And so could they be a team that targets a move up? Sure. I think that's a possibility if there's somebody that they really love there. We've talked about the challenge in teams moving down because there may not be a lot of teams being really aggressive in the 20s trying to get up into the mid teens because the talent sort of levels off after about pick 8 or 9, and I think goes deep into the 20s, maybe even the 30s. So the Cardinals probably stick and pick, but this is the team that could get aggressive if there's a defensive lineman or a corner that slides maybe a little bit, and there's somebody that they really like there. I think in that 16 range, you can get a top-notch wide receiver to pair with Marvin Harrison Jr., maybe like a Matthew Golden, Tetairoa McMillan. You could get one of the guards. Maybe LSU's Will Campbell slides. You have Texas Kelvin Banks Jr., Alabama's Tyler Booker, Gray Zabel from North Dakota State, or one of the secondary cornerbacks. And there's some rumors that Michigan cornerback Will Johnson could slide a little bit. I hate that. I refuse to believe it, but I guess it could happen. Everything's possible. So maybe that would be a player that they target to move up. But Maxwell Hairston from Kentucky, Trey Amos from Ole Miss, Darian Porter from Iowa State, or even the injured duo, Siobhan Revel from East Carolina, Notre Dame's Benjamin Morrison, all of those players could be in play, which again gets us to the point where you think teams would love to move down because that's a lot of options, and the Cardinals would probably be happy with any one of those players. But who's going to move up knowing the same information? So what I wanted to talk about a little bit just to close this out is who are some players that the Cardinals should at pick 16?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating because we've kind of entered this range now that we're down to pick 16 in the middle of the first round, where a lot of these guys are going to have similar grades from this point on to the early second round. And so just trying to figure out who's still going to be on the board. Is it going to be a guy who you have rated significantly higher that's fallen a little bit, or are you kind of into this, we just grab the best player that matches up with our need, that's kind of the same graded throughout this next collection of picks? But if Kenneth Grant were to fall this far, I think he makes all the sense in the world for the Arizona Cardinals. I could see a world where Ole Miss's Walter Nolan and Oregon defensive tackle Derek Harmon could even be in the mix as early as 16 here. They need help along that defensive line. I think that makes a lot of sense. But I could also see the Cardinals at 16 kind of as the floor for like someone like you said, Will Johnson, maybe, who is falling a little bit. But man, I just have a hard time seeing a player going much later than 16 here. But crazier things have happened. But Arizona needs that outside corner who can match up with big physical wide receivers. And so I like that fit a lot. But if I had to guess, I think we'll see Arizona exploring the talent in the first couple of rounds in this loaded defensive line class. There's just a lot of guys here, 3 or 4 players who I feel like they could go with, whether that's Walter Nolan, Derek Harmon, or if Kenneth Grant were to fall this far in the draft. I think that makes a lot of sense for them.
Yeah, and I think all of those are probably the preferred options for Arizona. But because they really focused on defense in free agency, I think you can go get Kyler Murray some additional help as well. And I love the idea of pairing Matthew Golden with Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride. I think his skill set really accents theirs. And there's a really fun storyline here with Arizona's Tetero McMillan potentially staying in state with the
Mhm.
Cardinals, adding yet another weapon to this offense. I do think there's a little bit of redundancy there with Tet McMillan's skill set, but still, like if they view him as wide receiver one,
Mhm.
then I think, just the act of adding another weapon, suddenly you can really give Kyler Murray the opportunity to prove himself and have a big bounce back year.
I think that's one of the reasons that Carolina, that Arizona is so interesting because they could go in 2 very different directions. Sometimes when we talk through these teams, it's like, well, do they address the defensive line or do they address like corner, and still trying to work out the same issue like of the defense. But here, like it's defensive line trenches or a weapon on the offensive side of the ball. And those are 2 very valid directions that they could go that would help this team immensely. Do they value helping Kyler Murray finally find his footing a little bit better, or do they fix one of the biggest needs on this roster with the defensive line? So lots of options. You don't have to talk me into Matthew Golden. He's one of my favorites. So I love that fit there as well, potentially going to Arizona. But so many different ways that Arizona could go with it. We got a couple weeks before we're really, really getting close to the NFL draft. So thanks for joining us for another one of these conversations of On the Clock. Make sure you like and subscribe to the show and stick with us as we preview all 32 teams in this series leading up to the 2025 NFL Draft. From the draft room to the gridiron, the Draft Fellows have got you covered. Until next time, stay tuned and stay in the game.